Historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild.
Imagine a state so desperate to save its wetlands that it decided to fight snakes with snakes. When Florida wildlife officials announced they were setting loose thousands of a native predator into the same swamps already crawling with invasive giants, the internet exploded with jokes. People called it insane, reckless, a punchline waiting to happen. But what looked like a joke on the surface was actually the final move in a decades-long battle to save one of America's most important ecosystems. And the results of that gamble are something almost nobody saw coming. To understand why Florida made such a strange choice, you have to go back to a place that once felt untouchable. The Everglades used to be one of the most complete, self-sustaining wild systems left in North America. Sawgrass prairies rolled out for miles. Alligators patrolled the sloughs, wading birds filled the sky at dusk, and small mammals moved through the underbrush in numbers that felt endless. This wasn't just scenery. It was a functioning economy of nature worth billions of dollars every year through tourism, fishing, and flood protection for millions of people living nearby. Nobody imagined that this balance could quietly collapse, but it did, and it started with something almost nobody was watching closely at the time. In the early 1990s, a massive hurricane tore through South Florida, damaging buildings and infrastructure across the region. Among the destruction was a reptile facility, and in the chaos, a number of large exotic snakes escaped into the surrounding wetlands. At the same time, another quieter problem was unfolding. Exotic pet owners who had bought Burmese pythons as babies were suddenly facing snakes that grew far larger than they expected. Rather than dealing with the responsibility, some released their pets into canals and marshes, assuming the animals would simply blend into the landscape and disappear. For a while, that assumption seemed true. Sightings were rare, and most people barely noticed anything had changed. But pythons are patient animals, and Florida gave them everything they needed to thrive. The climate matched their native range in Southeast Asia almost perfectly. Prey was abundant, competition was non-existent, and there wasn't a single natural predator built to challenge a fully grown Burmese python. Females can lay dozens of eggs in a single clutch, and with no real threat to keep their numbers in check, a small founding population turned into an uncontrolled expansion over the following decades. Today, researchers estimate that anywhere from tens of thousands to potentially several 100,000 pythons now live across South Florida. And that number keeps climbing every year because the swamp is simply too vast and too dense for anyone to fully search. The impact on native wildlife has been staggering. Long-term surveys comparing wildlife populations before and after the python invasion found dramatic declines in mammals that used to be common throughout the region. Raccoons, possums, bobcats, marsh rabbits, and white-tailed deer all showed steep drops in areas where pythons became established, in some cases falling by well over 90%. These aren't just numbers on a chart. Every one of those species played a role in keeping the ecosystem balanced, from controlling insect and rodent populations to serving as prey for birds of prey and other predators. When you remove that many animals from the middle of a food web, the entire structure starts to wobble. What made the python such a uniquely difficult problem to solve wasn't just its size. Although some individuals have been documented well over 15 feet long and weighing more than 100 pounds. It was how invisible they were. Their patterned scales blend seamlessly into the sawgrass and shadows of the wetland floor, making them almost impossible to spot even for trained researchers standing just a few feet away. Add to that the sheer size of the Everglades, which spans over 1 million acres of nearly impenetrable terrain, and you start to understand why simply hunting the problem away was never going to work. Florida did try, though, and it tried hard. Public hunting competitions were introduced, drawing hundreds of participants from across the country willing to wade through waist-deep water and thick brush for a shot at capturing a python and winning prize money. These events captured public imagination and media attention, and they did remove real numbers of snakes from the wild. But when researchers compared those totals to population estimates, the math was brutal. Even a successful hunting season might remove a few hundred snakes, a fraction of a percent of the total population believed to exist. For every python captured, uncounted others were hatching somewhere deeper in the marsh, completely out of reach. The state didn't stop there. Wildlife agencies brought in professional contractors paid to hunt full-time, developed detection dogs trained to sniff out python-scent trails, deployed drones to scan the wetlands from above, and even experimented with fitting captured male pythons with radio trackers so researchers could follow them back to breeding females during mating season, a method known as using scout snakes. It was inventive, well-funded, and genuinely creative science. But year after year, the honest conclusion kept repeating itself in research papers and agency reports. Total eradication of the Burmese python from the Everglades is not realistic with current technology. The best anyone could hope for was slowing the spread and protecting specific high-value areas. That growing sense of limitation is what eventually pushed conservationists toward a very different kind of strategy, one that had actually been in development quietly for years before it ever made headlines. Instead of only trying to remove the invasive predator, what if the solution involved restoring a native one that had been missing from the landscape for decades? Enter the eastern indigo snake, a species that once ranged across a huge stretch of the southeastern United States, from Florida up through Georgia and into parts of Alabama and Mississippi. This is not a small or timid animal. Eastern indigos can grow past 8 feet long, making them among the longest native snakes in North America. Their scales carry a deep, almost iridescent blue-black sheen, with a warm reddish-orange blush along the throat and chin that gives them an almost regal appearance. They are non-venomous, generally calm around humans, and completely unbothered by prey that would send other predators running. Indigo snakes are known to eat rodents, birds, frogs, turtle eggs, and notably, other snakes, including venomous species like rattlesnakes. They appear to have a natural resistance to pit viper venom, which lets them tackle prey that most predators avoid entirely. For most of the 20th century, though, the eastern indigo was disappearing. Habitat loss from logging, agriculture, and development wiped out the vast majority of the longleaf pine forests it depended on. Indigo snakes rely heavily on the burrows dug by gopher tortoises for shelter during cold weather and for nesting. So as tortoise populations declined from hunting and habitat destruction, indigos lost their homes right along with them. The exotic pet trade added more pressure, pulling wild individuals out of an already shrinking population. By the late 1970s, the species had declined so severely that it was formally listed as federally threatened, and by some counts, fewer than 50 distinct breeding populations remained anywhere in the wild. This is the piece of the story that got buried under all the jokes. Conservation groups and wildlife agencies had spent years running a careful captive breeding and habitat restoration program, working to bring the eastern indigo back to parts of its historic range in North Florida and Alabama, where it had vanished generations earlier. When word got out that officials were releasing large numbers of these snakes into areas already dealing with a python problem, most people only heard more snakes and reacted with alarm or ridicule. Social media lit up with comparisons to famous ecological disasters, like the introduction of mongooses to Hawaii that ended up harming native wildlife instead of helping. It felt on the surface like Florida had lost its mind, but the comparison didn't actually hold up because the eastern indigo isn't some new species being thrown into an unfamiliar environment. It belongs there. It evolved there. It was a keystone predator in these exact ecosystems long before pythons ever arrived, and its disappearance was itself one of the quiet losses that allowed the broader system to become unbalanced in the first place. Bringing it back wasn't a wild gamble dreamed up overnight. It was restoration, built on the basic ecological principle that healthy, diverse ecosystems with a full set of native predators are naturally more resistant to being taken over by outside invaders. And then something happened that even cautious scientists didn't expect quite so soon. In the wetlands and pine flatwoods where indigo snakes had been reintroduced, researchers began finding evidence that the population wasn't just surviving, it was reproducing entirely on its own. Trail cameras and field surveys documented wild-born hatchlings in areas where the species had been locally extinct for roughly half a century. These weren't snakes raised in captivity and released. They were born in the wild, to wild parents, without any human involvement at all. For a conservation program built on patience rather than quick fixes, This was the moment that mattered most. It meant the population had crossed the threshold from artificially maintained to self-sustaining. Around the same time, field reports started documenting something else remarkable happening across the wider Everglades ecosystem. Native predators, that had been largely absent from the python story for 2 decades, started showing up in unexpected ways. Trail cameras caught alligators preying on smaller pythons. Researchers tracking a large adult male python for a breeding study found the animal dead in the grass, and a follow-up camera revealed the culprit was a bobcat less than half its size, an animal that under normal circumstances would never be expected to take down a fully grown python. Sightings of Florida panthers investigating or preying on juvenile pythons also began appearing in research footage. None of this meant the python problem was solved, but it did suggest that after years of one-sided defeat, native wildlife was slowly adapting, learning, and in some documented cases, actively fighting back. None of this erases the scale of the challenge still facing the Everglades. Nobody working on this issue claims that reintroducing eastern indigo snakes is going to eliminate Burmese pythons from South Florida, a population that may number in the hundreds of thousands, spread across more than 1 million acres of dense, often inaccessible wetland, cannot be wiped out by any single predator, program, or piece of technology. What indigo snakes can realistically do is prey on juvenile pythons before they reach breeding age, compete for some of the same prey resources, and help restore a small but meaningful piece of the ecological pressure that used to exist before the invasion began. It is one part of a much larger, slower puzzle that also includes ongoing hunting programs, habitat management, and continued research into new detection and removal methods. There's also a strange complication tangled into this recovery story that most people never hear about. Along with the pythons came a parasite originally native to Asia, a lungworm that has since spread into numerous native Florida snake species through the local food chain. This parasite can cause serious, sometimes fatal respiratory damage in snakes that have no natural resistance to it, adding another layer of pressure onto native reptile populations that are already trying to recover. Interestingly, some native species, including the Florida cottonmouth, appear to show a natural resistance to this parasite, something researchers are still working to fully understand. It's a reminder that ecological problems rarely arrive alone, and solving one issue often reveals another hiding just beneath the surface. Similar reintroduction efforts have expanded beyond Florida into Alabama, where wildlife agencies have released their own growing numbers of captive-bred eastern indigo snakes into restored longleaf pine habitat, adding to a regional population that has been rebuilt over more than a decade of coordinated conservation work. Partnerships between state agencies, universities, and nonprofit conservation organizations continue to expand this program, monitoring released individuals, protecting gopher tortoise habitat, and tracking new generations as they establish themselves across the landscape. What makes this story genuinely compelling isn't that a native snake turned out to be a silver bullet against an invasive one. It's that an approach built on ecological restoration, something that takes years of patient, unglamorous work with no guaranteed payoff, actually produced measurable results in a system that many experts had privately written off as permanently altered. The irony is hard to miss. The same public that cheered on python hunting competitions as heroic conservation work initially mocked the quieter, slower effort to bring back a native predator, without realizing both approaches were aimed at the exact same goal of restoring balance to a broken ecosystem. The Everglades are not fixed. The python population remains a serious, ongoing threat, and researchers are honest about the fact that full eradication is likely impossible with the tools available today. But for the first time in years, there are real, documented signs that the system isn't purely losing ground. Native predators are adapting. A once-vanishing species is reproducing on its own in habitat it hadn't occupied in 50 years. And a plan that was ridiculed as one of the strangest ideas to ever come out of Florida wildlife management is quietly turning into one of the more promising conservation stories in recent memory. So the next time you hear about a state releasing predators into the wild and your first instinct is to laugh, it might be worth asking what problem they're actually trying to solve, and whether the answer is more complicated and more hopeful than the headline makes it sound.